On the last night of October, in the year 1817, with the rain coming down so hard it seemed the sky itself had a grief to be rid of, the Duke of Wintermere stood before the great cold hearth of his hall and said the words his whole household had learned never to question. "Neve," he said to his butler, without turning from the fire, "if one more matchmaking letter arrives from London, you may burn it unopened, and you may tell anyone who asks that I would sooner burn this house to its stones, with myself inside it, than ever take another wife." The old butler, who had served 3 generations of the family, and had watched this one turn slowly to ice over 3 long years, bowed his head and said only, "Very good, Your Grace." And at that exact moment, as though the storm had been waiting for the words to be spoken aloud so it could answer them, there came a knock at the great door, not the confident knock of an expected guest, a small, broken, desperate knocking, the sound of someone with almost no strength left, hammering against oak with the last of it. The Duke did not know, as he frowned toward the sound, that the woman on the other side of that door was soaked to the bone, hunted, wrongly accused, and carrying, sewn into the lining of her cloak, the one thing in all the world that could save the house he had just sworn to burn. He did not know that she had walked 11 miles through the storm to reach any door at all, and that his had simply been the first light she had seen. He did not know that the small locket around her throat would, before the season turned, undo him completely. He knew only that someone was knocking, at midnight, in the rain, and because even a frozen man cannot leave a soul to die on his step, he told Neve to open the door. That was the whole of it. That was how she came in, a man who had sworn to let no one near him again, opening his door on the worst night of the year, to the one person who would walk straight past every wall he had ever built. But to understand why the Duke of Wintermere had turned to stone, you must first understand what he had lost, and what it had cost him, and why a knock at midnight frightened him far more than any storm. Before we go on, if you enjoy long, slow, gentle stories to fall asleep to, do one small kindness for me now, at the very beginning. Tap subscribe, and tell me in the comments which city you are listening from tonight. It helps this little channel more than you can know, and I love to imagine all the quiet rooms this story is drifting into. Now dim your lamp, settle deep into your pillow, and let us begin properly. Everard Falkirk, the 5th Duke of Wintermere, was 34 years old, and he had not laughed once in 3 years. He had been warm once. He had married Rosamond for love, which is a rare and reckless thing for a duke to do, and for 6 years they were happy. Then, in one gray week of autumn, a fever took her, swiftly and without mercy, and left him with a great cold house and a daughter of 3 who had watched her mother carried from the room and had not spoken a single word since. That was the wound beneath the wound. Lady Beatrix Falkirk was 6 years old now, grave and pale and silent, with her mother's dark eyes. The physicians shrugged. There was nothing wrong with her throat, they said. She simply would not speak, and her father, who loved her with a fierce and helpless love, had begun, to his lasting shame, to avoid the nursery, because every time he looked at her he saw Rosamond's eyes in a small, silent face, and could not bear to sit in the one room where the loss doubled, so he had frozen. He ran the estate, answered his letters, refused every matchmaking mother in 3 counties, and kept the vow he had made a month after the funeral, standing at this same hearth. He would not marry again. He would not love again. He had loved once, entirely, and it had very nearly killed him. That was the man who stood before the fire on the last night of October, and swore he would sooner burn his house than wed. And that was the man who heard, in answer, a small broken knocking at his midnight door. "Who in God's name is out in this?" he muttered. "I cannot think, Your Grace," said Neve. "We expect no one. The bridge at Fenn's Crossing will be under water by now. No carriage could come." Then whoever it is came on foot. Everard frowned. 11 miles of open country lay between Wintermere and the nearest town, and the storm was the worst of the year. On foot, in this. "Open the door, Neve. Quickly, before they drown on my step and haunt me for it." And so the great door was opened, and the storm came roaring in, and with it, half fainting across the threshold, came a woman. She was soaked so completely that she seemed made of the rain. Her dark cloak was black with water, and clung to her like a second skin. Her bonnet had long since given up. Her hair was plastered to a pale, exhausted face, and her lips had gone faintly blue with cold, and she was shaking so hard that she could barely stand. And yet she stood, gripping the doorframe, and she did not fall. And there was in her eyes, beneath the exhaustion, something that Everard would only later understand, the particular fierce stubbornness of a person who has been running for a very long time and has decided that she will not, whatever else happens, fall down in front of strangers. "Forgive me," she said, and her voice shook with cold but did not beg. "I would not have knocked. I saw the light. I have walked a long way, and the bridge is gone, and I could not find the town. I ask only shelter until the storm passes. A stable, a barn, anywhere out of the water. I can pay a little. I will be no trouble, and I will be gone at first light." Everard looked at her, and something in his frozen chest shifted, faintly, like ice moving on a river before the thaw. He did not welcome the feeling. He distrusted it at once. But he was not a cruel man, whatever else grief had made him, and one did not put a half-drowned woman back into a storm. "You will not sleep in a stable," he said, more roughly than he intended. "Neve, Mrs. Pettigrew, hot water, dry clothes, a fire in the blue room, and something warm for her to drink, quickly, before she takes a chill that finishes her." The woman's eyes widened, as though kindness were the one thing she had not braced herself against. "You are too generous, sir. I did not know whose house this was. I would not impose so far." "It is the house of the Duke of Wintermere," said Neve, "and you are speaking to him." He watched her take that in. He watched her straighten, despite her exhaustion, and drop into a curtsy that was, he noted with some surprise, perfectly correct. The curtsy of a woman who had been raised gently, or trained thoroughly, or both. Not a peasant then. Not a common vagrant, a gentlewoman fallen on very hard times, or a servant of the upper sort. "Interesting. Your Grace," she said, "I am sorry to bring the storm into your hall." "The storm was coming regardless," he said. "What is your name?" She hesitated. It was the smallest hesitation, a half-breath. But Everard had spent 3 years watching for the small dishonesties of the people who wanted things from him, and he caught it. She was deciding, he thought, how much of the truth to give. "Sabine," she said. "Sabine Marrow." "And what are you doing, Sabine Marrow, 11 miles from anywhere, on foot, on the worst night of the year?" And there it was again, that flicker, that careful calculation behind tired eyes. "I was traveling to seek a position," she said, "a governess's post. My arrangements went wrong. I lost my way. That is all." It was not all. He knew it was not all. A woman traveling to a respectable post did not arrive on foot at midnight with terror living behind her eyes. But she was swaying where she stood, and whatever her secrets were, they could wait until she was warm, and dry, and less likely to collapse. "We will speak in the morning," he said. "Go with Mrs. Pettigrew. Rest. You are safe here tonight." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her face, some brief unguarded gratitude, cut through his cold like a blade of light through a shuttered room. "Thank you," she said. "I will not forget it." Then she let the housekeeper lead her away, and Everard stood alone in his great hall with the fire and the storm, and he did not know, could not have known, that he had just let into his frozen house the one person who would, gently and without meaning to, set the whole of it alight. What he did not know was this: Sabine Marrow was not traveling to a governess's post. She was fleeing from one. Until 3 days before, she had been companion and secretary to an old and half-blind gentleman named Mr. Hollis, whose affairs were run by his smooth and dangerous man of business, Mr. Sylvanus Croak, and Sabine, who was clever and quiet and had a gift for figures that her employers always underestimated, had discovered by accident, copying deeds one gray afternoon, that Croak was a forger. For years, he had been quietly forging deeds and mortgages across the county, transferring the lands of trusting old men into the hands of a hidden partner, ruining family after family who never understood what had happened until it was too late. And among the forged papers, she had found one name that would come to mean everything: the estate of Wintermere. Croak held documents she had seen with her own eyes that pretended the Duke owed vast secret debts he had never contracted, an entire false ruin built to topple one of the greatest houses in England into a hidden master's hands. So she had taken the proof, the forged papers, and the true ones that exposed them, meaning to carry them to a magistrate. But Croak found her out, and did the cleverest and cruelest thing he could. Before she could accuse him, he accused her, raising the alarm that the quiet Miss Marrow had robbed her employer and fled in the night, and setting the law and his own hired men after her as a thief. And so the one woman who could hang Sylvanus Croak could not go to the law, because the law was hunting her. She could only run and hide and try to reach someone powerful and honest enough to hear her before his men caught her and the papers vanished forever. She had not known, when she saw the light and knocked, whose house it was. When Neve said the name, Wintermere, she had nearly fainted for a reason that had nothing to do with the cold. Of all the doors in all the county, the storm had driven her to the one man whose ruin she carried sewn into her cloak. She did not know yet whether that was a disaster or a deliverance. She only knew that she must be very, very careful, and tell him nothing until she understood what kind of man he was. Sabine woke the next morning to gray light, a soft bed, and the strange forgotten sensation of being warm. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then she remembered, and her hand went at once to the place beneath her pillow where she had hidden the papers before she slept, and she found them safe, and she breathed again. The storm had passed. Beyond the window lay a drowned and glittering park, 1,000 acres of dripping trees under a washed pale sky, and beyond it, hills. It was a beautiful, cold, sad view. The view of a house with everything and nothing. Someone had left dry clothes for her, plain and good, and a tray with bread and chocolate, and Sabine, who had not eaten properly in 3 days, ate every crumb, and then sat very still, thinking hard about what to do. She could not stay. That much was certain. Croak's men would be searching the county, and a strange woman in a great house would be talked of, and talk traveled. She should take her host's charity, thank him, and go, and try again to reach a magistrate in some town where she was not known. That was the sensible plan. She was still forming it when she heard, from the corridor outside her door, a small sound. She rose and opened the door, and there, standing very still in the passage, was a child, a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, in a gray dress too plain for a duke's daughter, with dark solemn eyes and dark hair and a face of such quiet grief that Sabine's heart turned over. The child was staring at her with open, wordless curiosity, the frank stare of a very young person who has not yet learned to pretend. And there was something in her stillness, some held breath quality, that Sabine recognized at once, because she had seen it in herself, long ago, after her own mother died. "Good morning," said Sabine gently. The child did not answer. She only looked, with those grave dark eyes. "I am Sabine," she said, crouching down so that she was small, no longer looming, the way you make yourself small for a frightened animal. "I came in out of the storm last night. Do you live here?" The child nodded. "Once." "It is a very grand house," said Sabine. "Grander than any I have ever seen. Do you know, I think a house this size must have at least 100 rooms, and I should think at least 3 of them are haunted." Something flickered in the child's eyes. Interest, alarm, delight. All 3. "Not frightening ghosts," Sabine said quickly, seeing it. "Silly ones. The kind that lose their heads and go looking for them in the larder. The kind that get their sheets caught on the banister. In my experience, the grander the house, the sillier the ghosts. They have too much time, you see, and nothing to do but practice moaning." And the child smiled. It was a small smile, and it went as quickly as it came, and the child clapped a hand over her own mouth, as though she had been caught doing something forbidden. But it was a smile, real and sudden, and startled out of her. And Sabine, who did not yet know that this child had not smiled in the memory of anyone in the house, only knew that she had made a sad little girl smile, and that it felt like the first warm thing that had happened to her in a very long time. "I did not catch your name," said Sabine. The child's smile faded. She looked down. She did not answer. "That is quite all right," Sabine said easily, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Names are private. You may tell me yours when you decide I am worth telling. In the meantime, I shall simply call you, let me see. I shall call you my lady, because you have exactly the posture of a queen, and exactly the eyes of someone who notices everything and says nothing, which is, I have always thought, the cleverest way to be." And the child looked up at her, and in her grave, dark eyes was something that had not been there before. Not a smile this time, something quieter and larger, the beginning of trust. That was how the Duke of Wintermere found them a moment later, coming up the corridor with a frown, having been told his unexpected guest was awake. He stopped short, because there, crouched in the passage, was the strange woman from the storm, and beside her, closer than she stood to anyone, was his silent daughter, looking up into the stranger's face, as though she had found something she had lost. "Beatrix," said the Duke, and his voice came out rough with an emotion he could not name. The child startled and stepped back, and the shudder came down over her small face again, the familiar grief, the familiar silence, and Sabine watched it happen, and understood, in one clear, terrible instant, everything about this house, the frozen father, the silent child, the great, cold, beautiful ruin of a family that had loved and lost and did not know how to thaw. She rose from her crouch and curtsied. "Your Grace, forgive me. I was only saying good morning to the young lady. We were discussing ghosts." The Duke was staring at his daughter, who had retreated to the wall. "She does not," he began, and stopped, and started again, and his voice was not quite steady. "She does not usually go near strangers. She does not go near anyone. She has not, since—" He could not finish it. "Since her mother died," Sabine said quietly, gently, not as a question. The Duke looked at her sharply. "How did you know that?" "Because I know that stillness," said Sabine. "I wore it myself once. My mother died when I was 7. For nearly a year I did not speak, except when I could not help it. It is not stubbornness, whatever people tell you. It is that when the biggest thing in the world has happened, all the small words feel like lies, and so you keep silent rather than lie." She looked at the child pressed against the wall. "She will speak again, when she has something she cannot bear not to say. You cannot pull the words out. You can only make the house safe enough that they come out on their own." The Duke of Wintermere stood in the corridor of his great cold house and stared at the drenched stranger he had taken in at midnight, who had made his silent daughter smile within a morning, and who had just described the private country of his own grief more truly than any physician in 3 years, and he felt the ice in his chest give one long, deep, dangerous crack. "Come to the library," he said, more harshly than he meant, because he was frightened. "We must speak about what is to be done with you." What was to be done with her turned out to be a longer conversation than either of them expected. He meant to give her money and send her on. He told himself so. But in the library, in dry clothes, with the gray light on her face, Sabine Marrow was a different creature from the half-drowned woman of the night before. She was quiet, composed, intelligent, and watchful, and when he questioned her, she answered with a careful precision that told him she was choosing every word, which ought to have made him trust her less, and instead, strangely, made him trust her more, because she did not gush, and she did not flatter, and she did not once, mention that he was a duke, or angle for his favor, or do any of the 100 small performing things that people did in his presence. And there was the matter of Beatrix. "My daughter," he said, at last, unwillingly, "has not spoken in 3 years. She does not go near strangers. This morning she stood closer to you than she has stood to anyone since her mother died, and I am given to understand you made her smile." He paused. "I do not know how you did it. I am not certain I believe it. but I find I am not willing to simply send away the first person in 3 years who has reached her." Sabine went very still. "Your Grace, what are you asking?" "You said you were traveling to a governess's post," he said. "You have no such post now. The one you were promised will hardly wait for a woman who never arrived." He was watching her. "Stay. Be her governess. For a season, at the least. See what you can do. I will pay you well, and you will have a home, and my daughter will have someone who understands her silence. That is the bargain. It is a fair one." And Sabine, who had planned to be gone by nightfall, who carried in her cloak a secret that could destroy this very house, who was hunted across the county by a man who would kill her for what she knew, sat in the library of the Duke of Wintermere and felt the whole of her careful plan collapse under the weight of a silent child's grave dark eyes. She should refuse. Every rational part of her screamed it. To stay was to risk everything. Croak's men were searching. If she were found here, she would bring ruin down on this house that had shown her only kindness. And there was the other, worse danger, the one sewn into her cloak. She held the proof of a plot against this man's estate. Sooner or later she would have to decide whether to tell him, and how, and what he would think of her when he learned she had known and said nothing. But there was the child. "I will stay," Sabine heard herself say, "for a season, on one condition. That if I ever tell you I must go, suddenly and without full explanation, you will let me go, and not hold me, and not think too badly of me. There are things in my past, Your Grace, that I cannot speak of yet. I am not what Croak, I am not what some would say of me, but I cannot prove it yet. And until I can, I must sometimes be free to protect you and your daughter from my own troubles by leaving. Will you accept that?" He should have pressed her. Any sensible man would have pressed her. Who was Croak? What troubles? What was she hiding? But there was something in her face, some deep, exhausted honesty beneath the secrecy, that told him she was telling him the truest thing she could afford to tell, and he found, to his own surprise, that he trusted it. "I accept," he said, "though I warn you, Miss Marrow, I am a curious man, and you have made me very curious indeed." "I know," she said, with the ghost of a smile. "I shall try to be boring." She did not succeed. Within a fortnight, Sabine Marrow had changed the whole weather of the house. She did it the way she did everything, quietly, without seeming to try. She did not force Beatrix to speak. She simply filled the child's silent days with things worth breaking silence for. One wet afternoon, 3 weeks in, it nearly worked. Sabine was telling the tale of a very fat ghost who haunted a larder and kept getting stuck in the doorway, and she acted out the sticking, wedged in an invisible frame, huffing and heaving and blaming the pastry, and Beatrix, curled in the window seat with a slate forgotten in her lap, made a sound, a real sound, a short, bright, helpless peal of laughter that escaped before she could stop it. For one whole second, the child's face was pure, open joy, the joy of a 6-year-old who has forgotten to be sad. Then she heard herself, and her eyes went wide, and her hand flew to her mouth, and the shutter came halfway down again, as though laughing aloud were a betrayal of someone she still grieved. Sabine did not pounce on it. She only smiled, and went on with the story as if nothing had happened, and let the child keep her small victory unwatched. But she had seen it, and she understood it. The words were in there. The joy was in there. They were only waiting for the house to be safe enough to let them out. After that, the days grew warmer by degrees. She taught lessons that did not feel like lessons, drew maps of imaginary countries, and let Beatrix rule them in writing, with laws about the proper treatment of dogs and the banning of cold porridge, and took the child out into the wet grounds to learn the names of birds and get thoroughly, gloriously muddy, which no one had permitted in 3 careful grieving years. And slowly, slowly, the shutter behind the child's eyes began to lift, and the father watched. He told himself he was watching over his daughter, but the truth, which he admitted to no one, and barely to himself, was that he had begun to watch Sabine Marrow. He found excuses to be near the schoolroom. He found himself lingering at dinner, which he took with her now, because it seemed absurd to make the governess eat alone when the great table sat one grieving man in a cold hall. He found himself telling her things about the estate, about his tenants, about, eventually, in a low voice one evening by the fire, about Rosamond, whom he had not spoken of aloud to anyone in 3 years. And Sabine listened the way she listened to Beatrix, completely, without rushing to fill the silence. And he found that grief, spoken aloud to someone who did not flinch from it, weighed a little less than grief kept locked in the chest. He was thawing, he knew it, and it frightened him, and he could not stop it. His vow, the great cold vow he had sworn at the hearth, that he would sooner burn the house than wed again, began to feel less like a shield and more like a cage. And every day the woman who was quietly dismantling it grew dearer to him, and every day he understood a little less how he was to go on without her when the season ended and she left. What he did not know was that she was falling too, and that it terrified her far more than it terrified him, because she carried a secret that could turn all his new warmth to ice in a single afternoon. Let us pause there a moment and breathe. If Sabine and the silent child have found their way into your heart, do me the small kindness I asked at the start. Tap subscribe and leave a comment telling me which city you are listening from tonight, and whether you have guessed yet what she carries sewn into her cloak. It helps this quiet channel more than you know, and I love reading where in the world these stories travel. Now settle back down, get comfortable, and let us go on, because the warm days at Wintermere are about to end, and the storm that follows will be worse than the one that brought her. It was Beatrix who found the locket, and Beatrix who, without a word, set the whole reckoning in motion. They were in the schoolroom on a wet afternoon, and Sabine had taken off the small locket she always wore to clean a smudge from its face, and had set it on the table for a moment. And Beatrix, quick and curious as she had become, picked it up before Sabine could stop her, and pressed the tiny catch, and it sprang open, and inside was a small painted portrait of a woman. Beatrix stared at it, and then the child did something she had not done in 3 years. She made a sound, a small, sharp, wounded sound, high in her throat, and she looked from the little portrait to Sabine's face and back again, and her eyes filled with tears, and her mouth worked, and Sabine, alarmed, gathered her close and asked what was wrong. What was it? What had frightened her? And at that moment the door opened, and the Duke of Wintermere came in. He saw his daughter crying, which was rare enough. He crossed the room quickly, and then he saw what the child was holding, the open locket, the small painted face inside it, and Everard Falkirk went white to the lips and stopped as though he had walked into a wall. "Where did you get that?" he said, and his voice was terrible, low and shaking. "Where did you get that portrait?" Sabine looked from his stricken face to the locket and did not understand. "It is my mother, Your Grace. It is a portrait of my mother. She died when I was a child. It is the only likeness of her I have." "That is not your mother," the Duke said. "That is my wife." The room went very silent. "That is Rosamond," he said, and he took the locket from his daughter's hands with fingers that shook and stared at the small painted face, and his whole cold, careful world seemed to tilt. "This is my wife's face. Why do you carry a portrait of my dead wife? Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" And Sabine, staring at the little portrait she had carried all her life, the portrait of the mother she had lost at 7, felt the floor of the world drop away, because she looked, truly looked, for the first time, at the resemblance, and she saw that he was not wholly wrong. The woman in her locket and, she realized now, the great portrait of the late Duchess that hung in the gallery, the one she had passed 100 times. They were not the same woman, but they were, unmistakably, once she saw it, the same blood, the same dark eyes, the same particular line of the brow, the resemblance of family. "Your Grace," she said slowly, her mind racing, reaching, understanding. "What was your wife's name before she married you?" "Her family name." "Ashby," he said. "Rosamond Ashby." "Why?" And Sabine closed her eyes, because the last piece had fallen into place, and it was so strange and so large that she could barely speak it. "My mother's name," she said, "was Clara Ashby. She married beneath her, against her family's wishes, and they cast her off, and she never spoke of them, only that she had a younger sister she had loved and lost when the family turned her out. She opened her eyes. "Your Grace, I think my mother was your wife's sister. I think the reason this child wept at my mother's portrait is that she saw her own mother's face in it. I think your daughter and I are cousins." The Duke of Wintermere sat down slowly in a small schoolroom chair, far too small for him, and put the two portraits side by side, the locket and, when Neve was sent running for it, the miniature of Rosamond from his own dressing room, and there was no doubting it. The same blood, two sisters, torn apart by a proud family, one married to a duke, and one cast out to marry a poor man, both dead now, and their daughters, the silent child and the hunted governess, brought together by a storm on the last night of October, in a house that belonged to neither of their mothers. "Beatrix," the Duke said softly, to his daughter, "Sabine is your cousin, your Aunt Clara's child. Your mother had a sister, my darling, whom she lost long ago, and here is her daughter." And Beatrix, silent Beatrix, looked at Sabine with her mother's eyes, and reached out, and took hold of Sabine's hand, and held it very tightly, as though she would never let it go. It should have been a moment of pure joy, and it was, for a moment. But Sabine, watching the Duke's face soften into wonder, feeling the child's small hand grip hers, knew that the discovery had done something terrible as well as wonderful. It had bound her to this house, and she still carried, sewn into her cloak, the proof of the plot against it. And now she could no longer tell herself she would slip away quietly and let these people be. They were her family, the only family she had left in the world, and she was going to have to tell the Duke the truth, all of it, the theft that was not a theft, the papers, the forger who hunted her, the plot against Wintermere itself. And she did not know whether, when she did, he would believe her, or whether he would look at her as he had looked for one terrible moment over the locket, as a stranger who had come into his house carrying secrets and turned to ice again forever. She was still gathering her courage to tell him when the choice was taken from her, because the next afternoon a carriage came up the long drive, and in it were the two people in all the world she least wished to see. The first was Lady Hercilia Grendon, a handsome, hard, ambitious widow who had been trying for 2 years to marry her daughter to the Duke of Wintermere, and who had heard, through the fast and poisonous channels of county gossip, that the frozen Duke had suddenly taken a strange young woman into his house. She had come, under the thin excuse of a neighborly call, to inspect the threat and destroy it if she could. Beside her sat her daughter, Miss Clarice Grendon, pretty and vacant and trained like a spaniel to smile, and the second, riding behind the carriage on a dark horse, in a sober coat, with a smooth and reasonable face and eyes like cold coins, was Mr. Sylvanus Croak. Sabine saw him from the schoolroom window, and her blood turned to water. She understood at once, with the swift, terrible clarity of the hunted, what had happened. Croak had traced her. It was not chance that had brought him to Wintermere in company with Lady Grendon. Sabine would learn the full shape of it soon enough, but she guessed the heart of it in an instant, standing at that window with her hand pressed to her mouth. Croak's hidden master, the person for whom he forged deeds and ruined families, the partner who would swallow up the Wintermere estate when the false debts were called in, was connected to the Grendons. It had to be. And Croak, hunting his escaped clerk across the county, had heard the same gossip Lady Grendon had heard, of a strange young woman at Wintermere, and had come to see whether his missing thief and the Duke's mysterious guest were one and the same. If he saw her, if he recognized her, he would denounce her on the spot as a thief and a fugitive, and the law would take her, and the papers with her, and everything would be lost. She had one advantage, and only one. He did not yet know she was here. She had a few minutes, perhaps, before the visitors were brought in, and the household assembled, and her face was seen. What she did in those few minutes was the bravest and most reckless thing she had ever done. She did not run. She had run for 3 days, and it had brought her only in circles. Instead, she went, quickly and quietly, to the Duke's study, and she took the bundle of papers from the lining of her cloak where they had lived for 3 days against her heart, and she laid them on his desk, and she wrote, in her quick, clear hand, a single line on top. Your Grace, before you believe anything the man Croak says of me, read these. Every word I have not told you is here. Forgive me. Then she went down to face them, because the only way to save the house was to stop hiding from the men who meant to burn it. They were assembled in the great drawing room, the Duke, coldly courteous, enduring the visit, Lady Grendon, all false warmth, her sharp eyes already scanning for the rival she had come to crush, Miss Clarice, smiling at nothing, and Croak, standing a little back, in the manner of a man of business attending his betters, his cold eyes moving over the room. Sabine walked in, and Croak saw her, and his smooth face did not change at all, which was somehow worse than if it had, and she watched him decide, in the space of a breath, exactly how to use her. Why, said Lady Grendon, turning, taking in the plain governess, dismissing her at once as no rival. And who is this? My daughter's governess, said the Duke, Miss Marrow. And Sylvanus Croak smiled. Miss Marrow, he said softly, savoring it. How very interesting. Your Grace, I am grieved to be the one to tell you this, in your own house, before your guests. But that woman is not a governess. Her name is not Marrow. She is a thief and a fugitive from the law. 3 days ago she robbed her employer, the elderly Mr. Hollis, of valuables and important documents, and fled in the night. There is a hue and cry out for her across the county. I have been hunting her myself, on behalf of the injured family. You have, I am sorry to say, taken a criminal into your home, and set her to mind your child. The room turned to ice. Lady Grendon's face lit with vicious delight. Miss Clarice stopped smiling, confused, and the Duke of Wintermere turned slowly to look at Sabine, and his face had gone very still, and she could not read it, and her heart broke a little, because she thought, in that moment, that she had lost him. Well, Miss Marrow, said Croak, gently, cruelly, certain of his victory, have you anything to say? Yes, said Sabine. I have a great deal to say, but I do not think you will enjoy it, Mr. Croak. She was frightened. Her hands were cold and her heart was pounding. But she had spent 3 days running, and she was done running. And there is a kind of courage that comes only when the running stops. Everything Mr. Croak has told you is true, but backwards, she said, turning to the Duke, speaking only to him, as though the others were not there. I did take papers from Mr. Hollis's house. I did flee in the night, but I did not steal valuables, and I am not a thief. I took papers because of what was written on them. Mr. Croak is Mr. Hollis's man of business, and he is a forger, Your Grace. For years he has been forging deeds and mortgages, transferring the lands and debts of trusting old men into the hands of a hidden partner, ruining family after family across this county. I found the proof by accident. I took it to carry to a magistrate, and before I could accuse him, he accused me, and set the law after me as a thief, because a hunted woman cannot testify, and a hanged woman tells no tales. Lies, said Croak, but something had moved behind his cold eyes. Among the papers, Sabine went on, her voice steadying, rising. I found forged deeds against this house, against Wintermere. Documents that pretend you owe vast secret debts you never contracted, bearing a signature you never made, built to be called in all at once so that your estate could be swallowed whole. I did not know, when the storm drove me to your door, whose house it was. When I learned, I was afraid to tell you, because how does a hunted stranger say to a duke, I carry the proof of a plot to destroy you? But I carry it still. I laid it on your desk not 10 minutes ago. Every document, the forged and the true, with the false signatures and the real ones beside them, for any honest eye to compare. Send for it. Do not take my word. I have never asked you to take my word. Take the papers, and your own eyes, and judge. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the Duke said, very quietly, Neve, go to my study. On the desk, you will find a bundle of papers. Bring them. "Your Grace," said Croak, and for the first time, the smooth voice had an edge of haste. "You cannot mean to credit the word of a fugitive over—" "I mean to read," said the Duke, in a voice that cut the man off like a blade, "what is written on my own desk, in my own house. You will wait, Mr. Croak, while I do." And they waited, in a silence you could have broken like glass, until Neve returned with the papers, and the Duke of Wintermere sat down and read them. He read for a long time. The room did not breathe. Sabine watched his face, and could not tell what she saw there. Lady Grendon watched Croak, and began, slowly, to understand that something had gone very wrong. And Croak watched the door, calculating, Sabine thought, the distance to it. At last the Duke looked up, and his face was no longer still. It was alight with a cold and terrible anger. But the anger, Sabine saw with a rush of relief that nearly buckled her knees, was not aimed at her. "These are my accounts," he said softly, "my true accounts, which only my own steward and my own bank should hold. How does Mr. Hollis's man of business come to have copies of my private accounts, unless he has been reaching into my affairs for years?" He lifted a second page, and here, a deed of mortgage against the West Farms, for £11,000, dated 2 years ago, bearing my signature. I never signed this. I have never mortgaged the West Farms. I have never borrowed a shilling against this estate in my life. He set it down and looked at Croak, and his eyes were like winter. But here is the signature, forged, and here beside it, Miss Marrow has laid 3 of my true signatures for comparison, and even I, who made them, must look twice to tell the false from the real. This is the work of a master forger, and it is, Mr. Croak, in a folder that also contains letters, in your hand, to your partner, discussing when the false debts against Wintermere should be called in. He held up the last page. "Shall I read to whom these letters are addressed?" And Lady Hercilia Grendon rose from her chair, her handsome face gone the color of ash, and said, "That will not be necessary." And everyone in the room understood, all at once, exactly who Croak's hidden partner had been, and why she had spent 2 years trying so very hard to marry her daughter into the house she had been quietly plotting to steal. It would have been enough, perhaps, to have it out there, privately, in the drawing room. But the Duke of Wintermere had learned something, in 3 cold years and 1 warm season, about the difference between a truth whispered and a truth witnessed. And he had learned it, though he did not say so, from watching a quiet woman refuse, again and again, to be believed on her word alone, and insist instead on the plain, unanswerable weight of proof, laid open for any eye to see. So he did not settle it in the drawing room. He settled it 4 days later, at the Michaelmas assembly at the county town, where the magistrate would be present, and the gentry of 3 parishes, and every gossip who had spread the tale of the thieving governess. He had the papers. He had sent, quietly, for the Duke's own bank agent, and for the families Croak had ruined, the trusting old men and their bewildered heirs, whose names Sabine had found among the forged deeds. And he had sent, most quietly of all, for a king's officer, to wait at the assembly doors. Croak came, because to flee was to confess, and because he still believed, smooth and confident to the last, that the word of a duke's fugitive governess could be talked away. Lady Grendon came, because she dared not be seen to hide, and Sabine came, on the Duke's own arm, in a gown of deep blue that Beatrix had helped to choose, walking into the very assembly where all the county had been told she was a thief. The whispers started the moment she entered. She let them. She had learned, from the Duke, or perhaps he had learned it from her, that you do not answer a whisper with a whisper. You answer it with the truth, laid open, before witnesses, where it cannot be unheard. The Duke did not make a scene. He was too cold and too clever for that. He simply moved through the assembly, gathering the right people to the card room, the magistrate, the bank agent, the ruined families, Lady Grendon, Croak, until the quiet room held everyone who mattered. And then he closed the door and laid the papers on the green baize table and said, in his even carrying voice, "Gentlemen, I have been told, as many of you have been told, that my daughter's governess is a thief. I have asked you here to see the truth of it, Miss Marrow, if you will." This time Sabine said very little. She did not need to. The Duke set the forged mortgage beside his own true signature, and let each man lean in and see for himself the thing that could not be argued with, a lie in ink, sitting next to the truth. Then he passed the letters down the table, in Croak's own hand, and the magistrate read aloud the name of the partner to whom they were addressed, and a low sound went round the room, like wind before a storm. One by one the ruined families recognized their own names among the stolen deeds, and understood at last that the bad luck that had broken them had never been luck at all. Fury dawned on face after face. What Sabine had told the Duke in a shaking voice 4 days before, the whole county now saw with its own eyes, and there is no undoing a thing a room full of witnesses has seen together. "I did not steal from Mr. Hollis," she said at the last, quietly, to the whole silent room. "I stole from Mr. Croak, the one thing he could not afford to let me keep, the proof of what he was. He called me a thief, because a thief can be hunted, and a hunted woman can be silenced before she is heard. I have been running for many days, gentlemen, carrying this against my heart, looking for one room honest enough and powerful enough to hear me. I have found it at last. Now you have seen what I carried. Judge it with your own eyes. I have never asked for more than that." The silence broke. It broke over Sylvanus Croak, like a wave over a drowning man. The ruined families were on their feet. The magistrate had the letters in his hand, and the king's officer at the door. Croak tried, of course, smooth to the very end, to talk, to twist, to name Sabine again, a liar and a thief. But you cannot talk your own handwriting off a table, and you cannot charm a forged signature into honesty when the true one lies beside it, and the county that had been so ready to believe the worst of a quiet governess proved just as ready, once it saw the proof, to believe the worst of the smooth man who had robbed them all for years. Croak was taken that night. Lady Hercilia Grendon, exposed as his partner, fled the county before the week was out, dragging her bewildered daughter after her, and did not prosper, and her name became a caution. And Sabine Marrow, who had walked into the assembly a rumored thief, walked out of it on the arm of the Duke of Wintermere, with her name cleared before all the county, and the whole poisonous story turned, in a single evening, from her ruin into her vindication. They did not speak of it, the two of them, until they were home, in the great hall, late, with the fire low. Beatrix was long asleep. The house was quiet, and the Duke of Wintermere stood before the same cold hearth where, one storm night, he had sworn he would sooner burn his house than wed again. "You saved everything," he said, "the estate, the name, the families that man ruined. You carried the proof of my destruction against your heart for days, hunted, alone, and instead of using it, or selling it, or slipping away and letting me fall, you laid it on my desk and walked down to face the man who could hang you, to warn me." He turned to look at her. "Why?" "Because of the child," said Sabine simply. And then, after a while, "Because of the child's father." The fire crackled. "I made a vow," the Duke said slowly, "at this hearth, that I would sooner burn this house to its stones than take another wife. I made it because I had loved once, and it had nearly killed me, and I did not think I could survive loving again." He came closer. "I have kept that vow for 3 years. I kept it against every matchmaking mother in 3 counties. I kept it against my own loneliness. And then a storm blew a half-drowned stranger onto my step, and within a season she had made my silent daughter smile, and told me the truth of my own grief more truly than I could tell it myself, and carried my ruin against her heart, and chose to save me with it. And I find, Sabine, that I cannot keep the vow any longer. I find I do not want to. I find that the thought of this house without you in it is the only thing left in the world that truly frightens me." "Your Grace," she began, unsteady. "Everard," he said. "My name is Everard. I should like, very much, to hear you say it." "Everard," she said, and it came out like a breath. "I swore I would sooner burn this house than wed," he said, taking her cold hands in his. "I was wrong. I have been wrong about a great many things, and I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong. I do not want to burn the house. I want to fill it with warmth, and with noise, and with you, and with the sound of my daughter's voice, which I have not heard in 3 years, and which I believe, I truly believe, will come back to us now that the house is no longer afraid. Marry me, Sabine, not to save the estate. That is already saved. Marry me because you are the bravest and truest person I have ever known, and because I have been frozen for 3 years, and you are the thaw. Sabine looked up at him, at this cold, difficult, grieving man who was cold no longer, and found that her careful guard, the guard of a woman who had been alone and hunted and disbelieved for so long, had finally, entirely, fallen away. I carried your ruin against my heart for 3 days, she said, and somewhere in those 3 days it stopped being your ruin and started being you. Yes, Everard, I will marry you. I will fill your house. I have been alone my whole life, and I did not know, until a storm drove me to your door, that I was walking toward the only family I have left in the world. And from the shadows of the great staircase, where a small figure in a white nightgown had crept down unseen to watch, there came a sound that stopped both their hearts. Papa. One word, small and rusty and uncertain, the first word in 3 years, spoken by a silent child who had crept from her bed and heard and understood that the cold was ending. The Duke of Wintermere turned and saw his daughter on the stairs, and his face broke open like the dawn. "Beatrix," he whispered, and the child came down the last stairs in a rush, and he caught her up, and she said it again and again. "Papa, Papa." 3 years of silence pouring out in the one word she could not bear, at last, to keep inside, and Sabine put her arms around them both, the frozen father and the silent child, both of them thawing at last in the warm hall, and outside, gently now, kindly now, it had begun again to rain. They were married in the spring, at the little church on the Wintermere land, with the whole grateful county in attendance, including a good many people who had once whispered that the Duke's governess was a thief, and now would have sworn on their lives they had always known her for a heroine. People are like that. Sabine did not mind. She had stopped, somewhere in that storm and its long aftermath, needing the county to think well of her. She knew her own worth now, laid open and proven, and that was enough. Beatrix was the whole of the wedding party, in a dress the color of the first spring leaves, and she talked. She talked and talked, 3 years of stored-up words tumbling out of her, and no one in the family ever again, as long as they lived, told her to be quiet, because they had all learned the exact price of a silent child, and would have paid any sum to keep her chattering. The ruined families got their lands back, in time, with the Duke's lawyers and the Duke's weight behind them, and Wintermere, which had so nearly been stolen by forged debts, prospered instead, and prospered honestly, and became known in the county, not as the cold house of the frozen Duke, but as the warm house, where the strays and the wronged could always find a fair hearing, because its duchess had once been a stray and a wronged woman herself, and had not forgotten it. As for the locket, the little portrait of Clara Ashby, the lost sister, it was given at last a place of honor, hung in the gallery beside the great portrait of Rosamond, the two sisters reunited on the same wall at last, the Duke's late wife and the Duchess's lost mother, who had been torn apart in life by a proud family, and were brought together in the end by their daughters and a storm. And sometimes, on autumn evenings, when the rain came down hard against the windows of Wintermere Hall, the Duke and Duchess of Wintermere would sit together by the fire in the great hall, with their daughter reading aloud nearby and, in time, a small son asleep upstairs, and Everard would take his wife's hand and remember the vow he had once sworn at that very hearth, that he would sooner burn the house than fill it, and he would marvel at how completely, how gladly, how thoroughly he had been proven wrong. "What are you thinking?" she asked him once, on such a night, "that I nearly sent you back into the storm," he said, "that I stood at this hearth and swore I would let no one in, and an hour later there you were on my step, and I very nearly, out of habit, out of fear, told Neve to give you money and turn you away. But you did not." "No," he said, "even a frozen man cannot leave a soul to die on his step. It was the smallest decency, the last one I had left, and it saved everything I have. He lifted her hand and kissed it. I have thought about it often, how the whole of my life turned on one small, unwilling kindness, on the worst night of the year. It has made me very careful, Sabine, to leave the door open. You never know, I find, who the storm is bringing to you. Outside, the rain came down, gentle now, on a house that was not burning, that had never burned, that was instead full of light and voices, and the particular deep warmth of a family that had lost everything and found it again. Dear listener, wherever you are tonight, however hard the rain is falling where you are, I hope Sabine's story stays with you a little while after the lamp goes out, because this was never really a story about a duke, or an estate, or a forger's plot. It was about the doors we swear to keep shut. It was about grief, and the walls we build around it, and how those walls, which we believe are protecting us, are so often only freezing us. It was about a man who swore he would sooner burn his house than let anyone in, and a woman who was hunted and disbelieved and carried a heavy truth all alone, and a silent child waiting for the house to be safe enough for words. And it was about how one small kindness, done unwillingly, on the worst night of the year, opening a door you had sworn to keep shut, can turn out to be the thing that saves your whole life. So if your own door has been shut a long time, if grief or fear or old betrayal has frozen something in you, I hope you will remember Everard and his vow tonight, and remember that the walls we build to keep out the pain keep out the warmth as well, and that sometimes the thing knocking at the midnight door, the thing we most want to turn away, is the very thing that has come to thaw us. Sleep well tonight. Leave a door open, somewhere in your heart, even a small one. Be brave enough to be thawed, and remember that the people the world calls thieves and strangers and burdens are so very often, when you trouble to look with honest eyes, the bravest and truest hearts of all, walking a long way through the storm, hoping only that someone, somewhere, will see the light and let them in. If this story warmed you, leave a like, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments which moment was your favorite. The knock at midnight, the locket in the schoolroom, the reckoning at the assembly, or the first word a silent child spoke on the stairs. Thank you, truly, for spending this quiet hour with me at Wintermere Hall. Until the next story, good night.